like conversation is wrapping up and you guys want to come back into the main room, because if we're 7 people, that's almost the same size as a
Sure
group
enough, yeah,
would have
that's just
come
fine.
into.
Yeah.
So we can talk about that when we come back.
Okay. All right. Well, Norman Wiersbe, who is the subject of tonight's interview, is on the faculty at Duke Divinity School in North Carolina. His title is quite interesting. He is Research Professor of Theology, Ecology, and Rural Life. And that position title tells you some of the things about his scholarly interests, which lie at the intersection of theology with philosophy and ecology. And he runs an interdisciplinary group based at Duke, but it has international participation, called Facing the Anthropocene. And it sets out to force the various disciplines, humanistic disciplines and scientific disciplines, to rethink their approaches to climate change, food insecurity, and the environment, both the natural environment and the human environment. So I think you will find the interview with him quite interesting this evening. And it has subtitles tonight.
Yes. Okay.
What is the gospel, and can you experience that gospel if it's not in and through the other?
Well, I'm very skeptical of a private gospel. And I know that's tough for some people to hear because they want to say the relationship with God is private. It's just me and God. And I want to say, well, how do you know the God that is the God of you and me isn't some fantasy God that you've made up, because this is a God that helps you feel good about yourself, or this is a God who legitimizes the things you want to do anyway. Right? We need each other because we need other people saying, stop lying to yourself, stop lying to me. And we need other people because we need the nurture of others. We need the help of each other. And as a human being, we need to learn to help others, because a person who never loves another, that person can't fully become human. And when I say loves another, I don't mean just other people. Right? I'm learning this by reading a lot of sort of indigenous voices, First Nations peoples. One of the things that is almost universal amongst tribe people is they say when the Europeans came to this country, they set up a new way of relating to land as property, as a private possession. And the only thing that mattered is what you can get from the land. And so for the last couple hundred years or more, we've been really good at just raping the land, taking everything we can get in terms of its forest products, its minerals, its oil and gas, its carbon, its soil fertility. We're mining every square inch of this country that we can. We're mining the water, right? There isn't a river that's not been dammed multiple times in this country. Well, what that does, say these First Nations people, is it makes it so that they can't ever have a loving relationship with the land. They never learn to exercise their love for the land. And as a result, they don't have the experience of knowing that the land loves them back. And they say that human beings who come into the world in this mindset of property, mining, extraction, and don't ever feel the love of the land for them, they're psychotic, right? They are mentally and emotionally deprived. Because just, we talk about how a baby that never feels affection of a mother or father, right, how they become messed up psychologically. Well, these natives are saying people who never experience the love of the land, they're messed up psychologically. And it reflects itself then in all kinds of really screwy behaviors, right? How much stuff do we really need to have, right? We have bigger houses than we've ever had. They're packed full of stuff. So we go rent storage facilities to put more of our stuff. How much stuff do we really need before we realize the stuff ain't going to make us happy? Right? We're profoundly stupid people because we haven't learned something that basic. So we keep working. And this is, I mean, I'm not saying this is someone who's, you know, a model of all the righteous living that I'm talking about. It's hard because we're being bombarded by thousands of message and billions of dollars of advertising investment to say, go get more. And of course, just like when I was saying how we work to make the boss man rich, well, we purchase to make the boss man rich, right? And we don't see how we're being duped because we believe for some reason that if we have all this stuff, yeah, now I'm finally going to be happy. And we fool ourselves all the time.
The opposite of abundance. I mean, how did we get to like Jesus partying and like taking some food and like multiplying it and having leftovers and good times to like an agro industry that has plenty of food but everybody's still hungry?
Yeah. Well, that's a complicated story because it's not just that this happened in some haphazard way, it's planned, right? It's very clear when you look at the 20th century that major power brokers in the agricultural world, in the world of finance, in government sectors.
Not in this country.
Oh yeah,
It's a Christian country.
I know.
You're
Yeah,
talking
yeah. No. Forget that though. That lingo just doesn't work. But it's very clear that there was a concerted effort to make sure that we're going to have a particular kind of agriculture that's going to make agriculture industrialized, right? We're going to get rid of small-scale production, localized farming operations, local economies. Instead, we're going to centralize, we're going to consolidate, we're going to vertically integrate. I mean, there's a whole set of policy decisions that came into being to have the food system that we have. And people, for the most part, love it because we're getting more calories cheaper than we've ever had them before. But the trouble is that those calories come with a huge cost to our own health, to the health of our land, to the health of agricultural workers, to the health of our animals, our plants. Right, just to give you one idea of how this is sort of set up. Say that you're living in the eastern part of North Carolina and you want to raise chickens. But you don't want to raise chickens like you see in these big factory farms where the chickens are brutalized. You want to do something small scale. Chickens can get out in the grass because that creates healthier chickens, happier chickens. And the people eating those chickens are going to be much better off, right? So you want to start this better way of raising chickens. You go to your bank in this small town in eastern Carolina and you say, I want to take a loan out for $25,000 so I can start this chicken operation. Bank officer is going to look you in the face and say, forget it. I'm not going to give you a $25,000 loan, but I'll give you a $1.25 million loan if you build those big chicken barns. Now, what are you thinking? Why is this possible that they won't give you a $25,000 loan, but they'll give you $1.25 million? Well, the reason is simple. The government underwrites that $1.25 million loan because the poultry industry, they're working with the government to make sure that those investments are fully covered by you and me, taxpayers.
You need an exorcism.
That's crazy. That's crazy. And then say the farmer says, well, I got to make a living somehow, says, okay, I'll take that $1.25 million loan. They're now under the foot of Purdue, Tyson, any of these big chicken corporations that give you the contract. So the farmer takes all the risk by building these barns, and then the only way they can start to pay off the loan, it's a question whether or not they ever will pay off the loan because you got to do upgrades on all your equipment and your buildings as you go along, right? The only way you'll get a contract is if you've got the barns the way the corporations want it, right?
We need it up to code.
Yeah, and the thing is, you bring in these chickens, you raise the chickens. If they die, it's your problem. But you sell these chickens then to the corporation, and you're making minimum wage. It's crazy. But, you know, you think, I thought this was a free country. I thought you get to decide the future you want for yourself. Go to the bank and tell them that, and they'll laugh in your face. You can't decide to raise chickens in a responsible way because you're not going to get a loan. But if you do it irresponsibly and in a way that's going to damage the land, that's going to hurt you in the long run, we're happy to give you a loan. And we'll use taxpayers to make sure it happens.
So
That's
what's the
messed up.
church's role?
The church's role is to get behind farmers who want to do good stuff, to support farmers who want to do good stuff. The church's role is to call out a government that abuses people like this, right? We need churches who stand up to the big money interests that are doing so much damage, right? Churches, they will make big statements about issues like homosexuality. But why aren't churches making big statements, right? Having boycotts against some of these big money people who are doing so much damage? That would be really great.
It's going to ruin marriage, which there's already 50%, whatever, you know what I mean?
Right.
Versus like our food.
Yeah, I mean, we've got
You
our...
think about all the love, God's love that we are destroying.
Right, exactly. I mean, we have gotten ourselves in a situation where there are certain issues that we love to claim are the church issues. You know, things like homosexuality, things like prayer in the schools or prayer before government meetings, right? Those things, yeah, it's not to say they don't matter. Of course they matter. But the people who are championing those causes, they're so easy to champion, right? Why can't we have the 10 Commandments in our courthouse? Well, if you're a legislator, you might lobby for that and say, see how great a Christian I am because I'm doing that? Well, if you want to, I mean, it costs you nothing to do that, right? The government doesn't have to change a thing to put the 10 Commandments in the local courthouse. But if you really want to be the Christian in government and say it's wrong for us to treat migrant workers the way that we do, right? Or it's wrong that we've got all these inner city people who don't have access to good food, right? Now, when you say I'm doing that because God's love is telling me to do that, now you got to change policy.
Right.
You got to go to the big money people and say, guess what? You can't just keep making all this money when you're hurting all these people. You got to start doing stuff that helps people. Now, as a politician, you've actually done something that's going to make significant change, and you're doing it as a Christian witness. And that's really hard. And that's why churches need to stand behind the politicians who are going to say, it's time to do what's right. It's time to do the justice that the prophets talk about.
We're so worried about, like, you know, I'm standing up for my Christianity. It's like maybe like somebody going like Tyson saying, no, I need you to worship my God. And we're like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to put it, right? We've gotten sucked into this idea that what's good for America is good for God. It's good for people. And, you know, there's a lot about America that's good for people. But there's a lot about what's good for America that's not good for people.
Kill souls.
Yeah, it's tough. And we know it. It's all right, man. You want tissue?
What gives you hope, man?
What gives me hope? Hey, what gives me hope is just to see the people out there in the world who are inspired by God to do good things. What gives me hope is springtime, right? When you go into a garden and you see this love of God coming up in really good fruit. You know, I'm getting my first raspberries. I'm excited. Right? That's good. So yeah, I mean, there are dark times all the time. I mean, you read the Bible, there's darkness everywhere. But what's exciting to see is that in the midst of darkness, there's always light. And that light is shining through people, through places. And you just got to be looking. And too many people aren't looking. They're just too much wrapped up in their own despondency. And, you know, there's room for a lot of lament. We need a lot of lament because there's a lot bad that's going on. But that doesn't mean that the love of God has been extinguished. It's not, because the power of love in the end is what's gonna defeat everything else. Because the power of love is strong. And that's what Christians hope for. And, you know, hope isn't something you just say, well, I'll be hopeful today or I'll be hopeful tomorrow. Christians are called to hope, right? Faith, hope, and love. You got to have all three. And so hope's not an option.
Hi, Ina, welcome. So it took him a long time to get to a point of hope in that little clip, didn't it? Rick, what do you think? Should we stay in this group here?
You know, we're a small enough group. Let's just do it. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. We do have some set questions. Rick, if you have those and could throw them in the chat, we can do that. But hold, before you do that, I'm kind of curious to see what jumped out at you in this little segment, because there was a lot. And, you know, like where did your passion hit? What was a phrase or two that kind of caught your attention?
Well, the one that I keep focusing on, and perhaps is not the most hopeful one, but is how profoundly stupid people are. It's just the way he explains it, and you listen and you go, why are we doing this? We're creating problems, and it's just a vicious circle. It is silly.
Yeah.
It is sadly silly.
I was struck by the comment that what's good for America isn't always good for people and good for the soul. I think I've misquoted it, but it was something along those lines.
And I think what he said is we have told ourselves that's what's good for America is good for God. Is that what he said?
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. We think America and God are like that. Anything else?
What about this notion that the way things are is not inevitable or natural or predetermined? Again and again, he said, these things have been decided. These are choices. These are policies. It doesn't have to be this way. And that, to me, has been a theme that has come up through all three of the first installments in this series, is that we don't have to accept the things that we currently accept because they are part of bigger programs. I think that's a very important point, and he put it quite clearly tonight.
Mm-hmm. If you have those questions, do you want to put those in the, yeah.
Here they are.
So I thought we would start out a little bit by talking about this. Here it says, Wurzbach responds, I'm very skeptical of the private gospel. Have you ever heard that phrase before? What did he mean by that? And how might this be heard and held by many different people? The private gospel. I know, did you catch the very beginning? All right. It was at the very beginning that he spoke that phrase.
I thought it was another sort of attention-getting piece or kind of language that he used a lot through this. But I didn't have a specific reference to it, and I felt like, this might just be a blind spot of mine, that I didn't understand exactly what he was talking to, but it just sounded a little bit like he was saying that people think that they have a personal relationship with God and that that's how it's meant to be, but it can blind them to the fact that we're in community and that that's also godly. That's how I interpreted it, but I don't really know what private gospel meant exactly.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Shinkard, please.
you know, this private gospel to me seems to be rather new. When I was growing up, the gospel has never been privatized. And the first converts in our land, they all, the community became Christian, and they have the same, uh, we can say, sharing. And in our tradition, land and nature and our person are also connected. And every year at the beginning of the harvest time or a planting time, you have to have a religious sort of a ritual, try to thank God for giving us this land that we can grow something. We could take something out of it and support our life. And they have a kind of a social organization that at the planting time, everybody would, they would set up a schedule, and the whole community of people would go and plant there and then move on. And the harvest is the same way. That's my experience when I was growing up. But now it's totally different because, as you said, commercialized, and you have machinery to do that.
Mm. So there isn't that sense of community.
No,
No.
the farming is no more kind of a community business or community effort.
When he talked about the private gospel, he said that he felt uncomfortable with it because he was kind of saying, well, if you have, your own private understanding of God, then how do I know it's the same God that is watching out for me? And so that was an interesting comment, and I didn't know if he meant really an individual one-on-one with God, or if he was talking about the many, many different spin-offs of Christianity that came after the first Christians, because everybody wanted to nuance a little bit about, exactly how God was going to relate to people.
I think it was quite extreme, his notion of a private gospel or the private gospel. I think he was really talking about the tradition of personal piety. He was really talking about the kind of personal relationship with God that excludes everything else and that cannot be shared with anyone else because it is so deeply individualized. And he seemed just to reject that entirely out of hand. And I think that that's an entirely appropriate rejection. But I think that we have to understand that he was speaking against perhaps an exclusively U.S. American approach to religion and to piety. I don't think that notion that what's between me and God is between me and God only is very widespread around the world. What Ching Fen just described sounds much more typical to me. The notion of Christianity as community rather than the notion of Christianity as private acts of piety going only one direction.
I actually wondered a little bit. Sorry, can I go? Okay.
Oh, you're fine.
Specifically, his choice of words, private gospel. I mean, he didn't say private religion. He didn't say private relationship to God, specifically gospel. And so I was trying to figure out, I mean, the gospel, the word of God, is it a particular way of interpreting what you see as God saying? I mean, I have to be honest, I didn't quite understand the term. But I do stumble a bit on the choice of the word gospel, not religion or relationship or interpretation.
Yeah, I wonder if he used the word gospel to really specify that he was talking about Christianity, which is the gospel, as opposed to some other religion, Eastern religions or Judaism or anything like that.
Yeah, I kind of thought actually that he wasn't talking about the gospel at all, that he was talking about gospel in the sort of figurative sense, you know, the gospel of money, the gospel of this, the gospel of that, the gospel of privacy, the gospel of individuality. I'm not certain he was actually
Oh,
talking
okay.
about text there.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay. That's kind of different. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't understand it that way either. I thought of him as, I thought of it as a reference to religion.
Oh, okay.
But it's kind of an interesting take, I think.
Actually, the fact that it can be both makes it really interesting. I mean, I'm sure it was a deliberate choice. I'm sure he's a very learned man.
Well, he came up with it.
So Rick, you're saying that your emphasis was more on the private.
Yeah,
Is that what you're like? The key word there is the private gospel, right? Okay.
for me it was. Yeah, yeah. What was I just going to say?
He
Oh,
came up with it or something.
when he came out with the phrase, it was delivered quite clearly in a way that suggested we were supposed to know exactly what he was talking about, that it was a label for a known phenomenon.
Yeah.
Does anybody know, is it a label for some particular movement or action?
Nothing I'm familiar with.
Okay.
I don't know.
Never heard of it.
So I think, you know, that's what I understand is some brand of our Christian tradition only put the emphasis on person or individual. This is my individual matter and individual relation without relation with people or with land or with society. I was schooled in theology maybe over half a century before. And at that time, there was a missiologist, a German missiologist from Hamburg. My name used Walter Freitag. He has a small booklet called Gospel, Religion, and Christianity. I put in triangle, you know, and some people even want to privatize all three of them. Yeah, rather, you know, because what happened is that since enlightenment in Western culture or philosophy or thinking stressed so much on individual value or a person, and that sort of directed our faith, our religious practice into a private, personal matter.
I just looked it up, the phrase up really quickly. And there's lots of hits on those two words, private gospel, but most of them don't seem to be defending it. At least the top few that I looked at, they're not saying it's a great idea. They're saying, you know, it's about more than your personal gospel, and things like that.
One thing that he did not make a sort of pointed allusion to was the fact that by pursuing this private gospel, we end up incorporating ourselves into structures that are bigger than we are. He said, you know, being under the foot of the big chicken companies. And it's quite interesting, I thought, that that moving away from the private gospel or going into the private gospel didn't take you to private relationships. It puts you into a very large, inflexible, unyielding structure.
Mm. So how do we take this notion of private gospel, and how does that change the way we think about property and about each other? I think from what we've been saying, the private gospel is taking us away from community and not in a place of expansion.
Used very harsh language about raping the land. And again, that really gets your attention. And the idea that property is for our exploitation rather than land being for us to share and all use, but also help to sustain. I think that property takes us away from that a little bit. It's a mine versus yours when we have property instead of looking at all the land.
Looking at it as something that's to be shared. Taking what you need and not running it dry. Yeah.
And the private gospel, or the gospel of privacy, whichever way we choose to take it, also allows us to split up the idea of property from the idea of each other. We can look at our property without thinking about other people as we consider how to use it and what to do with it. And we can look at other people without thinking about how we can deploy our property in the greater good. So this private gospel really does, it divides. It divides.
I think also when we think so much about property, we maybe unconsciously get a false sense of, I mean, not just of raping the land and quote, deserving what it can give us or what we can get out of it, but also a false sense of security that we're, because we own it, it's okay to do, and we are able to do whatever we want. But I mean, things like weather, for example, then we can't actually control. But we think somehow because it's our property, we're safe in everything that we do. I'm not sure I'm expressing that very well, but.
Makes sense.
Yes and no. I'm also reminded of, this need to have property. And if you are in some kind of planned community, they still dictate what you can do with that private property that you feel that you have. Whether you can, even in Montclair, we have rules about what you can put on your property and what you can't.
I feel like I'm talking too much, so but I want to push back a little bit. I don't know that this is a different thing, but there's a concept in economics called the tragedy of the commons, and it has to do with if everybody has the same rights to certain kinds of common property, then there's a tendency to exploit them, to exploit the property, exploit the land, because you're not responsible for it. You're not responsible for what happens. So the example used in the classic article about it is if everybody has cows and they're allowed to graze on the common land, the tragedy of the commons is that you keep adding cows until you you know, that economically you're kind of driven to add more and more cows, and you keep eating, your cows keep eating the commons, the grass on the commons until it's used up. And we see it in real, you know, examples of from today have to do with private interests that don't take responsibility for all the externalities that are created by their work. So I might have a paper mill or whatever, but I'm pumping stuff out into the air, and that's not my problem. You know, you know, so it's ruining the air for everybody, but I'm just doing my paper mill thing. And I don't know, I mean, that's not exactly, it sort of feels like a corollary almost to the problem of private property, because it's not, it's about the use of, or the abuse of public lands because of, in my view, a lack or loss of a sense of community responsibility for it, or really of individual responsibility for community goods.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's really related to this topic, though. It feels related somehow, but you know, I'm not sure exactly how, but it didn't seem like quite the same point that that Wiersma was making.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting that your examples and his examples were all about extraction, mining, you know, cutting down all those trees, putting all the fertilizer on the land. Are there other kinds of property that we don't exploit by extraction? I mean, what does he think, for example, about people who live in houses? You know, that's property, and I'm not certain that owning that kind of property results in the same kind of distancing and division that these extractive uses do. I don't know. It's an honest question. I don't really know how to think about that.
I'm not sure what you were asking there.
Well, it just occurs to me that the private gospel justifies and in fact encourages extractive exploitation, the use of a finite resource until it's pretty much gone. And that is a way that it changes our relation to property. But there are other kinds of property that we do not exploit in the same way. And I was just wondering if the private gospel or the gospel of privacy or whichever affects the way that we connect to those kinds of property. And I don't really have any thoughts. I just had the question.
Well, also thinking about this notion of empire and how the government is involved, as he was describing the situation with the guy in North Carolina that wanted a sustainable chicken farm, which he couldn't get, but he could get this big, huge, giant loan. Are you familiar with that whole, you know, concept and sort of like where food comes from and how that engine seems to just keep churning? And it's not just the chicken farm, it's farming in general. It seems to be the government has its hands in it quite heavily. So when he's talking, I just lost that thought.
No, I think that's a really important part of what he had to say, Betsy. And it comes back a bit to his notion of intention and choice, that the government and the big companies, and it's hard enough to draw the distinction between them nowadays, but the government and the big companies are quite intentionally enslaving, indenturing, creating obligations on the part of those who they are pretending to help. And the example of this $1.25 million loan is very realistic. I mean, that's how most farmers live nowadays. You know, they take out huge loans the beginning of every season. They hope to pay them back by the end of the season. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, but they're left with nothing except the obligation to go back to the bank and get more money.
Did anybody have an opportunity or take the opportunity to watch that Netflix documentary called Kiss the Ground?
I didn't see it yet.
It, I rewatched it. It gets you to a much more hopeful point than our theologian did here tonight, but it does talk very much about, I mean, the basic principle is that, you know, we can actually restore the earth, and there are very specific ways, and making our soil healthy is the way. So the whole documentary is about making the dirt soil. And if you do that, it will, you know, bring all the CO2 gases down, et cetera, et cetera. But he talked a lot about that it's very hard to change people's minds from this farming that we have been doing since World War II ended. You know, this big, huge agricultural machine where the government tells people what to grow, pays them to grow it, pays them a set,
Not to grow it sometimes.
pays them not to grow it, and then pays them a set amount of money when harvest time comes due. And when you have been doing something like that, and it's true, it's not just farming, there are lots of machines that just keep churning and churning and churning, and it's like, this is the way we do it. So to disrupt that is very, very difficult. And at least in this film, there were people going around the country that were speaking to farmers who kind of all sat there like this until they could finally see it. And he led us to believe that changes were in fact being made. It was a little bit hopeful. But as he said in the film about us being stupid people, is we have to be the ones that stand up to this notion of we have to keep doing it this way. We have to keep having the government's hands in our farming. And I don't know about you guys, but every time the farm bill comes up, I have a rash of text from my kids telling me, vote for this and don't vote for that, and tell this right to your congressman and tell them that this is wrong. You know, they're pretty impassioned by it. Oops. There's one of my kids now.
They're calling now to let you know how to vote.
That wasn't the farmer.
I don't know. I feel like I feel a little perplexed by this question. I think I appreciate the point of sort of the drive of most businesses to perpetually try to grow and make more, sell more, and then make some more and sell some more. And I get that, you know, I get that problem, but and I certainly understand that it also applies to agriculture in some sense, but I don't think you'd have to go back too far to where having enough food was the big problem. You know, that people starved by the millions because we weren't very good worldwide at agriculture. And so I feel a little torn by this. That's my honest reaction, is I'm a little torn by this. It would be great if everything could be organic. I don't know why it can't. I have no knowledge of why it can't be different than it is. But I don't think it would be great to go back to cycles of drought and inability to grow and then starvation. You know, I don't think that would be great. So I kind of feel like there's some more discussion to have here that I'm not equipped to have, because I don't really know the ins and outs of farming, to be honest. You know, I don't know what it takes to do these things. I'm sympathetic to the argument that was made in that film, but I wondered in the back of my mind if there's maybe more to the story that we don't understand because we're forgetting history or something.
Yeah, and I kept waiting for him to bring a slightly more historically aware perspective to it. The Green Revolution solved a lot of the problems that you just described. But the Green Revolution then became something that we weren't willing to relinquish. All of the pesticides and herbicides and all of the big machinery and all of the very intensive agricultural practices solved a great big worldwide problem of hunger. It didn't solve distribution so much, but it certainly created supply.
Yeah.
But it became one of those things that we chose and we haven't been able to relinquish. So what we have now is abundance and poor quality and damage and abuse to the land.
Right.
And I think that the problem is that the mechanical and chemical mode of food production is so much easier than anything else. And I think too that increasing populations make it really hard for us all to have, chickens in the yard, and for us all to even think about returning to an agrarian lifestyle where we can support ourselves and then buy Christmas presents with the extra wheat. It is tricky. It is tricky. But what we need to do, I think, is understand and be aware of the fact that these are choices that we made in the early 1960s, and that they have come to seem natural to us, and they aren't natural.
Right.
Right. And I think it's the concern for the soil. People are always spewing a lot of facts, but in this particular documentary, they talked about, I don't remember the percentage of topsoil that has been lost in the last, 40 years, but he essentially said we only have 60 years of topsoil left, 60 harvests, and then we're done.
Holy crow. I didn't know that.
And that's because of the kind of farming that we are continuing to pursue, which is you get a guy with a bazillion acres and he plants one crop. And it used to take, 10 pounds of fertilizer per acre to grow this crop. Now it's taking 70 pounds of fertilizer to grow this crop. And it's just depleting the soil. So you have to disrupt that kind of cycle. And it's hard to do. So I guess what he's telling us here, what God's telling us here, is that we have to, back the right politicians that can see this.
And he was saying specifically the church should back those politicians that support those good things.
Yeah, I wondered what that looked like. How does the church back small farmers? How does the church back politicians with enlightened views on farm policy? I don't know how that works. I don't know how you do that.
They're literally prevented from backing politicians, just by the way. They are not permitted to do that. But they can speak to policy though. Yeah.
Well, you're saying they as if we're not the church. It is each of us.
Fair point.
Individually, and the church speakers can make people aware of what's going on and what's out there. And lots of churches get involved in community gardens and things like that. So that's one step that people can take. And if you think about, food deserts that are in some of our inner cities, including Newark, right next door, um, backing a politician who will look to disrupt that kind of situation is another way.
Well, I know, I don't think it exists anymore, but when I was growing up in Canada, there was a Lutheran backed, and it wasn't a bank, it was run by the church that had a lot of money that people could apply to directly to support these sort of community projects. Or so there was the ability to get the $25,000 that chicken farmer needed, for example. And I don't know if that's something that the church does in America. I just don't know. But I do remember, unfortunately, in Canada, it went belly up. So it's not, I'm not saying it was well run, but there was an attempt to do that.
We have a direct investment task force that has attempted to look into some of these kinds of things where we would invest in the community, in activities of the community,
Right.
and basically investing closer to home is the main idea there. And it's been interesting because it's I started on that task force. We haven't met in a while though, and it's harder than you might imagine to stand that up, to get something like that going. And there also aren't that many opportunities that we found that were really, that had consistent policies where there would be an entity we could invest in that would do this kind of thing in a community. We did find one that we invested in for housing stuff, but it's just a little harder to locate than you might have imagined. But that doesn't mean, I think it's worthwhile. I think what you're saying is really worth exploring and continuing to explore. And the church has tried at least a little bit on that front. And I think it should keep doing it.
Yeah, from about half a century ago, the churches in Taiwan, they organized this called Mutual Help Corporation and help people saving the money and use the money to loan to small project, not necessarily owned by the church, but different kinds of work in the community. And I think I observe it's quite successful, and it also strengthened the church. I have one special experience, interesting. I don't know whether that is relevant or not. Quite a few years ago, I was able to visit Romania. Romania, there was a group of Hungarian reform people still in Romania. They are not allowed to live in the city, because the new regime restrict them to live in the rural area. And they have very little cash. So the pastors, how they support the pastors is that they have this land, a lot of land adjacent to the church, that everyone come to plant something, and the produce is to support the pastor. And they do that. And I've visited the village, and I preach in that church, and they say that the church building was about 800 years old, the first one. And of course they have repair, and they say I was the first Asian ever to stand in the pulpit. And they are so curious about Asian. And so I was invited to visit the homes, different homes. And how they told us that, they have very little cash. but they do want to support their pastor. That's the way they do it. So it's a community, and their faith is nurtured by working together with that piece of land of the produce to support the pastor. And the pastor told me that his salary, if you put in the money, is almost only enough for you to go to the movie here once. That was the reality. But he said that the money he only needed when he need to buy a ticket to go to somewhere. Otherwise, in living in a community, and everyone feel like they are so close to the land and to life of each other. That's why they are so interested in invite me to their homes. I walk in the village, the little road. And they say, "Oh, come in, have a look, the house," and so on. That is something which I never experienced in this country. Here, my home is my castle. You are not supposed to come
The
in.
fortress.
Yeah, fortress.
Yeah. It's different here, especially in the Northeast. We're more guarded.
Yeah, and the kind of love, the church is the center where they gather, to work together. What we shall do next, to improve the village.
Kind of reminded me when I lived in California, there was a starving actor. Like there's a lot of them. And he finally made this nonprofit that we, the San Marino UCC Church, helped out with. Just like you said, Betsy, it's different out there. People have lemon trees, people have avocado trees. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Huntington Garden. Have anybody ever heard of the Huntington Garden? This gentleman, Huntington, was a railroad mogul in the turn of the century. And he had this beautiful house and a beautiful library book collection as well as art. And when he passed away, he's like, I want my land to be a museum. And it is. First, it was free. That was in the 70s and 80s. Now you got to pay some money to get on there. But he has all these orange orchards, and it just rotted. All the fruit rotted. So this starving artist from Hollywood said, why don't I create a nonprofit where we can pick, the orchid, the oranges and the food that's just going to rot. And we did that. It was filled. We would spend a Saturday morning and we'd have, I forget what they call they were like sticks with these little baskets on, and we'd get and I mean, you could spend, there was just so much out there. And once we picked it, it went to a food bank in the area, but there was just, as you said, it's different out in California. There's all these former orchids or orchards, or even just somebody's backyard, that they had. We'd go back in someone's yard and take their oranges or lemons or whatever it was. And it felt good to do that. We did it as a group. Maybe about a half a dozen of us would go and get up early that morning and spend a couple hours, and you were exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion. But that's been going on for years, that fruit, that those oranges were just rotting. And finally it was going to some good, but it was just somebody with an idea. He's like, I guess I can't make it as an actor. I gotta find it as a career. And took, made lemons out of the lemonade. So you felt good about that you could really take what was on the land, that they said, yeah, take it. Our focus is the museum. Our focus is the library here. Go knock yourself out and pick all the oranges you can. So it was a good feeling. And I think that's probably the third question there is like, how can you sustainable ways. And that was a way that,
Yeah.
we felt good as a church contributing. And then this guy who created this nonprofit felt good that, whatever we picked went to a local food bank.
Mhm. Do people have other thoughts about ways that we can participate in the abundance of community? Thinking about produce or other things? We as a church or we as individuals?
Well, I guess this is not quite participate, but I've been reading these books by, of course, I can't remember his name now, Douglas something or other. Anyways, he's talking about Nature's Best Hope. I don't know if you guys have read that, but it's all about trying to take back the sort of native land, like the land for native plants and for native bees, etc. And he's sort of advocating that. So it's not really participating in abundance, but it's trying to create the abundance again by, if every single, house or garden, instead of having all these massive green lawns, could go back to having even just a corner with whatever used to grow there, then the animals would come back and then they would pollinate better. And if everybody, even in Bloomfield, like even in one township, if everybody did that in one corner of their backyard, then there'd be a corridor for animals. So I mean, that's not exactly participating in the abundance, but it's maybe a way to actually concretely do something to bring sustainability back, rather than, I mean, changing policy is great, of course, but we all know how long that can take.
Right.
So yeah, that's what I was thinking about when I was looking at that. It's not exactly what the question is, though.
Well,
But
I disagree, Allison. That does strike me as a way to participate in abundance, because if your neighbors have the same kind of corner and their neighbors have the same kind of corner, and it establishes a corridor, and you've got, I'll take your bumblebee example, and you've got bumblebees flying from yard to yard to yard, doesn't that feel like community, and doesn't that feel like abundance, and doesn't that feel like participation?
Yeah.
It does to
Yep.
me. It does to me.
yeah, no, yeah,
Sure.
no, it should. Idea.
And it also
And-
serves to kind of create bonds between the pieces of physical property, I think. The boundaries start to vanish, not legally, but psychologically, ecologically. I think it's a great way to participate in abundance.
How many of you,
Well, and also, sorry,
sorry,
no, go ahead.
Allison, please.
say how many people shop at the farm,
Is it?
At the what?
at the farmer's market?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
another way.
Time to time.
I've grown a little skeptical about farmers markets over the years. When I see the big trucks pull up with produce that they've obviously just bought at the great wholesale houses.
Don't tell me that.
We're cynics.
But
You're busting my bubble, man.
but you can still find genuine farmers markets with genuine farmers, I think.
Yeah. Oh.
That's that skeptical Northeastern thing. I would never think something like that when I'm at the farmer's market in Durham. Those honest North Carolinians.
Yeah, I was my internet connection, I just got a message, is very up and down. So if I fade out, then just give me a signal. But when you were talking earlier, Rick, quite a while ago, about how else we might be sort of exploiting the land. Again, one of these things that this author is talking about is our our desire for these, 2, 3, 4 acre lawns that, like going back to Jefferson's place, that was a symbol. I mean, it's not just that it's a lawn, but it's a symbol that we have enough money to have a lawn that doesn't have to produce anything, right? So it's a sort of a status symbol. And that too, I think is an exploitation of the land, because we have made it sterile. We have turned it into, instead of a living, productive thing, we've turned it into an empty sort of status symbol, right? We can have these huge lawns and we are wealthy enough to do it, and therefore we will do it. So I think that's another way of, it's not really private gospel, but it's another way of, exploiting the land, even though it doesn't look like it. It looks, we've been trained to think that looks very pretty, but actually it's not pretty at all. It's dead. Anyways, I'm on my little hobby horse here.
At least it's not bare ground,
Right, not desert.
not desert.
Yeah, but I'm gonna be really aggressive here, but I mean, desert is actually, I would say, more alive than sort of these miles and miles of just, pure green lawn. I mean, even the birds don't go to it,
Mm,
because usually those lawns have so much pesticide in them that they're pretty much dead.
yeah, that's true.
Anyway, I'll be quiet now.
That's an interesting point. I don't know.
Good point.
Yep.
I think, the privatization of property and land and so on has contributed to like that, because we think that you have more land, you may have more control, and you can control others. There's a part of the empire. It's just not that to have something grown in your land. It's good. Like my experience in visiting Pacific Islands, for instance, everyone have some fruit trees on their yard, and if you happen to be hungry passing through there, you can pick it and eat that. You cannot say, "Oh, that's my tree." You cannot say everything. All the trees, the coconuts and everything is for everyone. But if you pick it and take the things to sell to others, and then that they think that it's against the practice, that's not right. So there's no, the sense of this is my own only. The tree grow the fruits. It's not only for you, but for everyone who's in need. That's something which I learned quite a lot. And most of the houses do not have walls because of the weather. They just have a roof. And if you run out of salt, you just go to the neighbors, and from their salt dish you get some. And when you have some more, you can return that. Their sense of private ownership is quite different from what we normally understand. This is mine, and that kind of nobody's going to take mine away without my permission. That kind of thing is, everything is for everyone. You happen to have that, we share that. That kind of idea. We always think that we our global world ministry used to try to help one local school to raise some chicken, and sometimes the neighbors would come and say, "Now, may I borrow some chicken eggs?" And they never return. They took that away. And so finally, I understand that to borrow does not necessarily mean that they're going to return. Yeah, and when they have some more, they could always give that to you. You are in need of it, like the fruit. If you happen to pass there and their fruit is ripe, you could pick it.
That's a very interesting and open community that I can't imagine that we will see here.
Yeah.
Maybe a little ways from that. Yeah.
And sometimes I feel a little bit, I feel sort of guilty. It's that our missionary, we send our missionary to teach them how to share.
Hmm.
And they are already, they know how to share. And then it's sometimes I just feel like, what kind of gospel are we going to give to this, or preach to them? And sometimes we have a lot of things to learn. They know that the land belongs to God, not to private. It happens to be that you have to take care of that piece of land, and whatever produce that happen to have, that everyone could cooperatively enjoy it.
That feels like a very good summary there, Tim Ben. Does anybody have any other closing thoughts or directions they'll be taking in the future to think more community? Think more soil.
We're going to have to watch that now.
It was very good.
It was very good. It changed my perspective a lot. I mean, I don't look at the ground the same way. I mean, I really, yeah, it's just, it should be treated as special and something that gives life and can sustain life, not something to be just stripped.
And it was hopeful, right? We can do it.
It was.
That's
It was.
I like. So. Rick, anything you want to say before I think we close this out? We're here at 8:16.
No, I think that happily this conversation has been sufficiently wide-ranging and diverse that it's impossible to sum up.
Sometimes things
I find that a good thing.
Yeah, that's good.
citizenship and as love for the land. Yes, it was a wide conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming and being part of it, and we will join again next week.
Right, everybody.
Yep.
Thank you, Betsy, Rick.
Thanks.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see Anna here.
Yes.